So globalization is the growing integration of the world's economies into one single economy. So before, it would be unheard of for the UK to trade with the US or the UK to trade with China or something like that. And now that's normal. That's what globalization is. It's not one thing, it's a process. So it's when slowly everything turns into one economy rather than the UK economy or the US economy. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So it's the growing integration of the world's economies into one single international economy.
Yeah.
Cool. How come globalization has happened more and more? So there's a few reasons. Okay.
Yep.
So one is technology. Technology means anything. It could mean the internet. How has the internet helped globalization happen?
Communication is better. Like
Yeah,
before,
you
you
can
had to
just
send
WhatsApp someone
letters.
in another country.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. And then also transportation. So rather than relying on like one ship that goes once in a while, there's ships going all the time, better ships, faster ships, bigger ships, and also planes and whatever with transport.
Yeah.
So you can get stuff delivered. Um, more trading blocks. So like the EU, which the UK left, but the EU is an example of where inside that trading bloc, there's free trade between members. So free trade, that's linked to free trade, which we'll talk about after. Okay.
Yeah.
The transportation is linked to more mobility of labor and capital. And lastly, more MNCs. MNC is a multinational corporation, like
Like Nike.
exactly like Nike. People know about Nike in different countries, and Nike has shops in different countries. So it comes from it's American, right?
Yeah.
But you have shops of Nike in every country. Yeah.
Yeah.
So multinational corporations. But that's not like the main cause because it wouldn't have been possible without internet and transportation. So these are just the reasons that globalization has happened. This isn't a popular question for an essay, but it's more like for 15 and 10 markers. They
Okay.
might ask you the causes of globalization, right?
Yeah.
Is that the fridge or the
That's the heater.
heater? So globalization has benefits and negatives. And the question will ask you what's good and bad about globalization. If
Yeah.
it's an essay, the best thing to do, always remember this, don't just go straight into the benefits and costs of globalization. Split it into four things rather than two things. Okay.
Yeah.
Got good and bad for high income countries and low income countries. Okay.
Yeah.
So globalization has good and bad effects on both. So it's good for low income countries and bad for them. And it's good for high income countries and bad for them, but completely different reasons. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's start with high income countries. And for this, let's just assume or let's say higher income countries and lower income countries. So, or developed versus developing countries. So let's say the UK is a developed economy. So let's just treat it as the HIC.
Okay.
And then we can treat China as the developing country. Okay. So why did the UK benefit from globalization? Well, we can get cheaper goods, like cheaper imports. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it would have cost us a certain amount to make a calculator, but someone in another country has already got a routine in a factory to make calculators very cheap, very easily. So importing loads of calculators is just cheaper than making our own.
Yeah.
Okay. That's linked to a downside and an upside in the low income country. Okay.
Yeah.
So in the low income country, that's good because it creates jobs.
I feel like we've done this whole topic in sociology.
Maybe that's good
Yeah,
then. Yeah. So it creates jobs in the low income country.
yeah.
What else could be good or bad in the low income country for that?
That they can also get the cheaper goods, right? Because they're producing it.
Oh
Well,
yeah, yeah, good. And
oh
also they sell the cheaper goods. So export-led growth in
yeah,
economics, that's the best way for a low income country to grow because of
okay,
their exports.
okay.
And then the downside would be that what?
That is it about the workers' inequality?
So we said the cheaper goods, right?
Yeah,
What if they're too cheap? Okay. So may get exploited.
yeah.
Okay. By exploited, it could be the country or most likely the
The working
workers.
conditions.
The workers get exploited because they're too cheap.
Yeah,
And it depends if this depends a lot on corruption in the growing country. If there's no corruption, then there's a lot of tax revenue that comes from the sale of these goods.
and the
Low income
economy grows.
countries work a lot on cash and no tax. And as they grow, they can start to increase their tax rates, both on workers, like salaries, and also the sales,
Yeah,
and especially on exports. Then that can go in to the two things that allow a country to develop even more. When we do development, we'll see that. But just from common sense, the two most important things at the beginning is health and
and economic growth.
uh before that, for children in developing countries, what do you want to give them?
Oh, is it the birth rates or something?
No, don't overcomplicate it.
Oh,
Imagine like you got a 10-year-old. What do you want to
yeah.
make sure they've got good health and then also,
Education.
yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah,
Also in the LICs, they may have like specific thing that they're good at because of what they find, like their resources, and those could be exploited instead of just the workers. So over dependence on resources
wow.
and then environmental damage. So if a low income country has a skill which they develop, so let's say they just become experts in IT,
Yeah,
then so a lot of, let's say, data engineers or something get hired from India by American or British companies.
yeah,
That's a skill, okay? So they can't get exploited for that,
yeah,
okay? Unless it's like low wages or something, but they have that skill which they can use. But let's say a country just finds fish. If that country tries to export the fish, other countries can exploit that and they're going to run out as well. So they won't be able to sustain their growth unless they act smartly about it.
yeah.
Yeah. And focus on the health and education.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
But also on the other hand, like all the countries in the Middle East are so rich. They actually, the BRIC countries, the BRIC,
Now, what's that?
like the, I don't actually know. They're like the wealthy countries, like um, or the developed economies.
Okay.
It's like the list of developed economies like UK, US, India, China, maybe. So, and then I think it's either Qatar or someone just joined that list,
Yeah. One
and
of the
that's
oil countries.
yeah, and that's because of they use their resource. Yeah,
Yeah.
so they're making use of their resources, and they just grew really fast.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's focus on the HICs.
Okay.
So the HICs benefit from cheaper goods. That means they can focus on other things which they're already good at. So can focus on what they're good at. What they're good at, there's a fancy word for that. Their own comparative advantage. That word is
Um,
important for this topic.
okay.
You might have had it in year 12, but I'll go over it again. Um, so that might create jobs in other things. Um, Also, over time, if the low-income countries grow, then they'll come back and demand the other services that the UK or high-income countries provide.
Yeah.
An easy example is that once China grew or India grew, they started to have a lot of wealthy people who could afford and wanted to go to universities in the UK because
Yeah.
UK universities are the best in the world, like Oxford and Cambridge and LSE and so on.
Yeah.
So once the low income countries develop, demand for those universities will increase and they charge massive amounts of money to international students, and the UK government can benefit from the tax revenues as well. And the
Yeah.
universities benefit from the money they get and they can reinvest in research and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So that also applies to like financial services or media, whatever. Okay. But
Okay.
university is a nice example. And also greater competition, which may also be bad in the short run, but over time, greater competition allows us to improve at what we're doing. And FDI is another good word, foreign direct investment. Um, on the downsides for high income countries, the main dangers are becoming over dependent. If we become over dependent on a country like China to produce certain things like say calculators,
Yeah.
China can increase and increase and increase their prices. And over time, if we haven't learned that, oh, if we need to, we should also make calculators, then we're over dependent on them. And then our imports can become very high. And then we have a current account deficit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that means our AD will go down because AD is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay. And then the X minus M can go down. And that can happen. So we're scared of economic shocks. Economic shocks can mean like China just raising their prices randomly because they have a fixed exchange rate. You might have done exchange rates in year 12, but we'll learn about fixed and floating exchange rates. China can just change their currency whenever they want. They can make it higher or lower. And
Okay.
if we're dependent on that, if we're not dependent, it's cool. If we're dependent on that thing, then it will affect our economy. So, for example, when there was the war in Ukraine and Russia, something happened with fuel and oil, and all the petrol prices in the UK went up because we couldn't get fuel from anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or energy prices and stuff like that. But economic shocks could also mean natural disasters. Um, and that would still affect us. So the 25 markers to expect in this topic are things like, is globalization good or bad for for the UK economy or for world economies, or is free trade good or bad, or is protectionism good or bad? And it all comes together. So first, let's learn what protectionism and free trade is.
Okay.
Free trade is the act of trading without any protectionism. Okay, so it's just no protectionism.
Okay.
What is protectionism? It's stuff that makes it harder to trade freely. So when governments intervene and put taxes on imports and stuff like that. Okay, so we'll learn about those after.
Okay.
So like tariffs, quotas, embargoes. We have to learn tariffs in a lot of detail with a difficult diagram. Let's do quotas and embargoes first. So quotas are just a limit on how much you can import. So they'll say something like you can import 100,000 pounds worth of fish from another country, from like China, or you can import 100,000 pounds from China. Like just a
Who
limit.
though? Who puts that? The government.
Yeah, the government would put it if they wanted to.
Okay.
Embargoes are bans, so like you cannot import anything from this country, or it could be about a specific good from a specific country. Yeah.
Yep.
Why would we do protectionism? So we would do protectionism to prevent ourselves from any of the negative impacts of globalization. So if a country is scared that they're over dependent or that their balance of payments will get worse, then they could think maybe we should do protectionism.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Low-income countries wouldn't normally do that because firstly, low-income countries barely import anything from high-income countries. China doesn't import anything from the UK, so they don't need to worry about the negative impacts of imports.
Yeah.
Okay. And secondly, if they're exporting, it's good for them. They're growing from it. It's mostly if developed countries are scared that they're importing too much.
Okay.
First of all, before we go on those negatives, why is free trade so good and so important? So let's look at these two words. Absolute advantage and comparative advantage. So the exact definitions are in the notes, but absolute advantage is when country A can produce something cheaper than country B. Okay.
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 Yeah.
So for example, let's just say cars and apples, UK and Thailand. I'm just making it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's say they could produce 150 cars or 100 cars and 100,000 apples or 95,000 apples. Who's better at producing cars?
UK.
Who's better at producing apples?
UK.
So the UK has an absolute advantage in both. Okay.
Yeah.
It's better at producing cars. They can produce cars at a lower cost. So they have the same budget. They can produce 100 versus they can produce 150.
Yeah.
So that's just to introduce you, but absolute advantage is pointless in economics because if the UK is better at producing both, it would imply that the UK should produce cars and apples themselves.
Yeah.
That's not good for anyone. Comparative advantage is who has the lower. So comparative advantage is when you have a lower opportunity cost at producing something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there can never be, the UK cannot have a comparative advantage in both things. It's not possible. Okay.
Yeah.
So one country will have a comparative advantage in apples, one will have a comparative advantage in cars.
So in this scenario, Thailand should produce apples, isn't it?
Good, because if you know basic maths, then you can just see it. Okay.
Yeah.
That this, the UK is 1.5 times better at producing cars, but the UK is only, I don't know the thing, but it's times like 1.1 or less than that actually.
1.05.
Yeah, something like that. Not exactly that. because it's
Okay.
100,000 divided by 95,000. Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
like 1.04 times or 1.06 times better. Yeah,
Okay.
at producing apples.
Yeah.
So because the UK are better at both, that's absolute advantage. The UK are much better at producing cars and a bit better at producing apples. So if the UK focus on cars and Thailand focus on apples, the total world output would increase. You could do the maths and see. So if they were half and half, you'd get 75 cars plus 50,000 cars, apples,
Yeah.
and 50 cars and 42,500 apples.
Yeah.
You can add it up and you get 125, 92,500. Or just UK cars, 150. Is that better than
Yeah.
125?
Yeah.
95,000. Is that better than 92,500?
Yeah.
But you don't need to show that in an exam, okay?
Yep.
But just show that, just state this theory. Just state that
Right.
comparative advantage theory states that if each country focuses on their comparative advantage, yeah, on what
Yeah.
they have their comparative advantage in, total output increases, like them added up,
Yeah.
compared to if they just produce their own thing,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And just show a quick table if you want, or a quick graph. Like a graph would look like this: cars, apples. One line would look like that. One line would look like that. A
Right.
PPF curve.
Yeah.
So one is a bit. You can show one being better at another, but it shows a good point if you're saying that one is better at both, but one is a lot better at one of them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Let's go back to this part and just emphasize this as one of the main points. Because when the essay asks you, because we had so many benefits and negatives, when the essay asks you, is globalization good or bad, or is protectionism good or bad, or is free trade good or bad, one of the best points is to focus on this, saying that everyone in the world theoretically should benefit from comparative advantage when trade happens.
Okay.
And then you can add one or two small points from the other ones. And then on the negative side, talk about the overdependence and the current account deficit, how there's never I give you like it never happens, right? Where the UK give China cars and China give an equal amount of value in calculators. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It always ends up that UK buy from China, UK buy from China, UK buy from China, America buy from China. So
Yeah.
one has a massive current account deficit, one has a massive current account surplus. And then that's where the problems happen.
Okay.
Okay. But so that's why protectionism might be a good idea. Maybe not. Okay.
Yeah.
Tariffs are a tax on imports. Okay. So just like as if you would tax sugar because sugar's bad, the UK government might tax imports because imports are bad.
Yeah.
Okay. There is a massive diagram, right?
Okay.
But when you see it a few times, it will become easy when you draw it yourself. But when you see it, you're gonna be like, what the hell? So it's a micro diagram, even though it's macro. So you have price and quantity. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you would assume it's on something. So in micro, remember, we always did it on like a market for chocolate or a market for something.
Yeah.
Okay. So you start off with your supply and demand, and you add one more curve. Okay. I'm going to rename this supply domestic. Wait, I'll make it even easier. I'll just say supply UK
Okay.
and demand UK. This one is supply. Oops. Supply world. Okay.
Yeah.
Step one in your essay, talk about why you've added that supply world and why it looks like that. So supply world is low and perfectly, no, it's not low, it's actually very high. That's why it's low, because supply is high. It's shifted so much to the right.
Okay.
And it's perfectly elastic. So it would be very, very, very elastic, not perfectly elastic, but we're just going to draw as perfectly elastic.
Okay.
Why would it be very, very, very elastic?
Because
There's so many sellers in the world.
oh
If you think of chocolate in the UK, people selling chocolate in the UK, relative to people selling chocolate in the whole world, there's going to be millions and millions and millions of people producing and selling chocolate from
yeah.
different like cocoa farms and whatever,
Okay.
right? So there's just so many sellers at a high quality because you're looking at the whole world.
Yeah.
Yeah. The UK sellers is nothing compared to that. Cool. Now we look at what happens. So we want to buy this much chocolate based on the demand curve, right?
Yeah.
We look at the cheapest chocolate. Until here, who's cheaper, the world or UK? Which one's
The
lower?
world.
Which one's lower? And before that point,
Oh no. Oh, UK.
UK. After that, who's lower?
The world.
Yeah. All of this, no, only this much is bought from our own sellers. So if someone in the UK selling chocolate will buy it from them.
Yeah.
All of this is imported until demand meets supply. If it's just without trade in year 12, that would be our equilibrium.
Yeah.
But that's not the furthest biggest equilibrium. This is our equilibrium, which
Oh.
means all of this is, and only Q1 is from UK.
Okay.
Does that sound good or bad?
That sounds bad
Well, it sounds good and bad. Why is it good and why is it bad?
because there's not a lot from the UK.
Perfect. And then the good thing is that we would have thought from year 12 knowledge that that's our price, but our actual
Oh
price is
yeah.
only that. So because we've introduced trade, it's so much cheaper.
Yeah.
Yeah. So try and remember what's what. So Q1 is what we buy domestic. Yeah.
Yeah.
UK demand or UK quantity. And then Q1 to Q2, the difference is imports.
Okay. So basically, this is the demand of our one, of our
That's how
economy.
much we buy from UK. Yeah.
Okay.
All of this is demand from UK people, but that up to Q1 is how much we buy from our own sellers, like our own local business and whatever.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so let's focus on the bad side. You said I said the good side was that it's so cheap.
Yeah.
So P1 goes here, right? And the bad side is that wait, the bad side is that there's only Q1 from UK.
Yeah.
Cool. What should we do? Let's tax it. What does the tax do in micro in year 12?
It makes them buy less.
What curve shift in a year 12 tax?
Um,
Demand or
eh,
supply?
isn't it supply
Yeah, left or right?
left?
Cool. So we're gonna shift world supply there because we're not taxing UK firms, we're taxing foreign firms. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
yeah. If we wanted to tax UK firms, then yeah, that would go there. But we're not, it's not in this topic.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. Just do the same thing you did. Okay, so now this curve doesn't exist anymore, but I'm still gonna keep it there because of the demonstration. So you keep it there in your diagram, in your essay. But you just do the same steps we followed through. So that's Q3 and that's Q4.
So now Q4 is the equilibrium.
Yes, correct. That's the new equilibrium. Q3 is how much we buy from the UK. New UK demand or sales, right?
It's the
So before, we bought from the here to Q1, but now, so Q1 doesn't exist anymore because like the supply's changed. So until Q3, the UK is cheaper because
Yeah.
we basically like cheated. Like we, so we're not cheaper than the foreign firms, but if we tax the foreign firms, then we become cheaper.
Yeah.
So we found like a cheap way out. So the good thing is, okay, now the UK get more sales and maybe they can use that money wisely. The bad thing is, what's the healthy long-term way to become cheaper than the foreign firms?
Get better producing.
Get better. Yeah, so supply side policies and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But that's not if you barely have any sales, you don't have that money to play with and improve. You don't have the profits, the supernormal profits, right?
Yeah.
So it can help to use that tax.
Okay.
Cool. So Q3 is the new UK demand. So 0 to Q1 turns into 0 to Q3. And what's the new imported amount?
Is it that
The e wait,
Q3
Q3
until the end?
what's the end?
Oh no, Q4.
Yeah, Q4 is the end now. That's the equilibrium bit. Like
Yeah.
where demand matches supply. After that, there's no
Yeah.
demand left. So yeah.
Yeah.
So then in your essay, this takes up a whole paragraph. Do you remember in essays in 25 markers, how if you have a good diagram to show, your diagram will itself be a paragraph because
Yeah.
the complicated ones, you can write so much about them.
Yeah.
So on the plus side, you can talk about comparative advantage. On the negative side, you can talk about um like protectionism and stuff and how it can help boost this to this and reduce that to like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it depends on the question. We'll practice that separately. But
Okay.
just state that this has gone up and imports has gone down. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Just like in year 12 micro, when we do government intervention like a tax, there's government failure. So here again, this triangle and this triangle show dead weight loss, which is a loss in consumer and producer surplus because the government have distorted the market.
Okay.
And if they get their calculations wrong, or if they don't know what to tax, or maybe they assume that the UK would improve once the world is taxed, and they assume that wrong, then there could be government failure. But it's the same arguments you would use in year 12
Okay.
in micro. So this is like a micro concept, but applied to macro. Right?
Yeah.
So you can talk about dead weight loss, government failure, like distorted markets. And another new thing, retaliation. So depending on what's happening, I if the UK government tax calculators from China, then China will tax UK universities. Not tax
Yeah.
UK universities, but they'll tax or like I'm not sure how because it's a service, but it's something you take here. But let's say Chinese people buy stuff from the UK, other stuff like cars,
Yeah.
then which they wouldn't because China are even better at producing cars as well. But let's say the Chinese government tax something back, then the UK are gonna okay, they'll gain Q1 to Q3, but then they're gonna lose out on something else because the other country's gonna get revenge, which is called retaliation,
Okay.
which is protectionism back. And then we go back to the whole thing about what happened to comparative advantage. It was a proven theory, like mathematically, that comparative advantage benefits everyone. And now
Yeah.
you're going back to like the olden days where I produce this, you produce that. No, I produce everything I need, you produce everything we need, even if we're not good at it.
Yeah.
So that's all. kind of like circle and your essay, your arguments.
Okay.
So the two common questions with current account deficit is either ways to reduce it or the impact of it. So if it asks you this question, let's just focus on that today. Your two sides of your argument in 25 marker would be side number one would be a current account deficit is very bad. And then number two would be a current account deficit isn't that bad.
Okay.
So the opposite would be that it's good, but we wouldn't say that it's good because then that's just not true, right? It's not going to be an amazing thing, but we can
Yeah.
argue that it's not that bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my intro in macro, 9 times out of 10. So obviously in the intro you have definitions. So I'll just define a current account deficit. So a current account deficit on balance of payments is when the value of exports is less than the value of imports. And then we just want to touch on what we're going to talk about. In macroeconomics, how do you measure the impact of something? Like if something is good or bad, how would we measure it?
Is it the effect it has on living standards?
That's one thing. What else?
Is it what it does to growth?
Sorry, say again.
Is it what it does to growth?
Yeah, good. A few more things.
Is it what it does to inflation?
Yeah, now you're getting it. So it's the four objectives. Yeah.
Yeah.
In macro, impact means if it doesn't specify, sometimes it will say impact on economic growth or something, then cool. If it just says impact, you should automatically think that it means impact on the four objectives. I would
Yeah.
first say that a balance of payments is one of the four objectives. So obviously it's going to be important, but we can see the impact, we can evaluate the impact of the current account deficit on the other three. Because then it becomes very bad. If a current account deficit is also making the other ones fail, then it's very bad. If it's keeping the other ones all right, then it can't be that bad. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm gonna pause it. Can you brainstorm a couple ideas of why you think it might be very bad? Let's leave that one because that's a bit harder. Let's start with this, and can you just brainstorm some ideas? So let's start really, really simple, as if so something from year 12. Aggregate demand. What's the equation for aggregate demand?
C plus I plus G.
Good. Plus,
Um, bracket X minus M.
yeah. So X minus M is the trade balance, which is basically what we're saying about a current account deficit. So if this is negative, then that brings AD down, right?
Yeah. So growth decreases.
AD would shift to the left, or AD would be low, or shift left during a bad current account deficit. And that means that price level goes down, which could be good or bad depending on where it was previously. But let's just say worst case scenario, it means deflation, which is bad. Deflation is very bad. You can expand on that in your answer. And also we can talk about the GDP going down and unemployment going up. So just the most simple answer allows us to expand the most and say so many things about the four objectives.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So point number 2 for why it's bad. So generally, like 2 really big paragraphs or 3 paragraphs or 4 paragraphs is good. But I generally think that if you've written really good quality paragraphs, 4 would be too many, even though some teachers suggest it, because you want to make
Yep.
really good paragraphs each time you do it. So I'd say 3 is good. So I'll do 2 for bad and 1 for good, or 1 for not that bad. Yeah.
Okay.
My other point for is very bad is that a persistent, it's going to sound weird at first, but it will come together. A persistent current account deficit is really bad. So first of all, a persistent current account deficit is one that happens year after year. So
Yep.
importing more than we're exporting year after year. Now, that's bad because it makes the UK vulnerable to shocks, economic shocks. Do you know what economic shocks are?
It's like supply side or demand side shocks. It's like
Yes. Supply side and demand side shocks. So, for example, wait, I'll pause it again. Try and think of. So, if there's a persistent current account deficit, we can assume that we're reliant on other countries' goods and services. So, and then obviously they love examples. So you can mention oil or energy or even other stuff if you can think of it. Yeah.
yep.
Okay. So like for example, just mention oil or energy or something like that. Now, if this is the part that you were trying to say, so if something happens, then we are in trouble. So what is that something? So we basically say if there is a price change, like or a supply or demand shock in that country, we will be in trouble.
Yeah.
For example, a shortage, or for example, strikes, or a war, or like different things like that, then we'll be in trouble because price will go up, price of imports will go up, and we won't be able to stop buying them because if we've made a pattern of just buying oil from another country, we really need that oil because we're used to it in our lifestyle. So it would take us at least a few years to make our own version of that particular thing. Or in the case of oil, we just won't be able to make it. And then if we're paying more for stuff like oil, what would happen to our AD or AS curve?
Does AS shift left because cost of production go up?
Exactly. SRAS shifts to the left. And then that causes a lot of inflation, cost push inflation as well, which is quite bad. Like it has no real benefit to it. So
Yeah.
unemployment will go up again, prices will go up, people will lose their jobs. It's just really difficult in our economy.
Yeah.
And when you're explaining why something is difficult or why something is good, what do you always talk about?
Um, how it affects the macro objectives.
The 4 objectives. Perfect. Cool. That's pretty much it. So you talk about an economic shock in the other country affecting or causing an economic shock in our country.
Okay.
And that's if the current account deficit is persistent, which means like we have a pattern of relying on other people's goods,
Yeah.
other countries' goods. Okay. Then finally, why a current account deficit might not be that bad. So there's a before I go into the main point, just a quick point. We always have a current account deficit, but we don't measure it in millions or billions. We measure it in as a percent of GDP. So if it's like a 4% of GDP or 3% of GDP every year, then that's not deemed to be very high. So that's one evaluation.
Yep.
But the main point about why a current account deficit is not bad in theory is because a current account deficit should always correct itself. It's just a theory. It doesn't actually necessarily happen. A current account deficit would correct itself because, so if we're importing a lot, what would happen to the exchange rate? So if we're importing goods in, are we supplying currency out or buying?
we're supplying the currency out, so would it become
So would the pound devalue or appreciate?
would it devalue?
Exactly. And if the pound was to devalue,
People buy from us more.
yeah, then that automatically makes our exports more attractive. And if our exports go up, then our balance of payments would balance again, right?
Yeah.
So that's a theory where a current account deficit should never last. But then that's it. So the order I would do it in is I would do this first, then I would do this, and then I would do this. But that
Okay.
kind of stuff you kind of have to just think in the exam what feels right. But in a plan, you just
Okay.
have the idea. So okay. Do you understand all three of the points?
Yeah.
Okay. Because then this one links straight onto that one, right? You can talk about how it
Yeah.
should correct itself, but it won't if it's persistent. So you can just touch on the
Yeah.
fact that you can evaluate it by talking about assuming that you are importing and exporting random things just purely based on price, purely based on where it is cheaper. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But this thing is suggesting that, like, okay, we're going to be worried if we're not, we're importing specific things that we have no idea of producing in our country.
Okay.
So this would suggest that we need the supply side policy. We need a strong supply side. Cool. So this is a plan. So what else is missing from this to make it a perfect? Because we got three good
Is
paragraphs.
it
What else
a
is
conclusion?
a conclusion and what else? Evaluation for each paragraph.
Oh yes, 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 yes. However, yeah.
So the good thing about the way we've done it is that the evaluation of this paragraph is directly linked to that. So you can just touch on it and move on to that one in more detail. But
Okay.
let's go through each one and see if we can evaluate them. So for the first one, we can evaluate it by basically saying, like you said, that this is just one of the four portions of AD. Why does it keep doing that? X-7 is one of the four parts of AD. And also, not just that it's just one of the four. So, well, basically, we're saying that AD won't go down that much, right? Just because of a deficit. That's what you're saying, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, but just to back that up and make this evaluation even stronger, when are we more likely to have a current account deficit? Is it when economic growth is high or economic growth is low?
Low.
Nah, high. Because if economic growth
Oh.
is high, there will
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
high consumption, high investment, but also really high living standards and really high disposable income. These are lots of the factors that are to do with an economic a boom. And during that time, people are going to want fancy things. So they're going to go on holidays, but they're also going to do stuff like import cars or import different expensive things.
Yeah.
They have that their taste buds are quite high, so and they've got high disposable income, so they're going to import more stuff then. So it could be a sign that the economy is doing well.
Yeah.
We'll stick to our main point here about unemployment, all this stuff, but after that, we can evaluate it by saying this. It's a really good point. And back up your point,
Okay.
just one of the 4 parts, by showing off by which other students won't do, by saying that it's more likely to be a deficit when all the other stuff is high. So we're really giving a good evaluation to our point.
Okay.
Cool. Let's do number 3 first and come back to number 2 because that was our order. So we said that a current account deficit isn't that bad. And we talked about how it should always correct itself. So we're talking about, we already mentioned that we'll evaluate it by saying that it kind of assumes you're importing and export random things purely based on the exchange rate and the cost of it.
Yeah.
And I can back that up even further with a really fancy, but it's actually simple, but the definition is like really overcomplicated. It's called the Marshall-Werner condition.
I think I've heard this before, but I don't remember what it is.
That's fine. So the Marshall-Werner condition states that a currency devaluation, that's not the, will only lead to an improvement in the balance of payments. Actually, no, this is perfect. It's literally what we were talking about. We talked about how the pound would devalue, which makes exports more attractive again. And this is literally saying that, hey, this will only happen if the blah, 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 blah. I don't want you to know all this fancy stuff. Basically, the point is imports and exports should be elastic. But then you say, but they probably aren't. That's like the baby way of saying this fancy stuff. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
Obviously, the most of the stuff we import, like for example, oil, that's going to be inelastic because we need it. And there's no way of getting it in another way to how we're currently getting it.
Yeah.
And also you can say that a lot of stuff that's imported from China, like just let's just say basic stuff like phone cases, they should be quite elastic. If worse comes to worse, we can produce them in the UK. Yeah. But
Yeah.
then if your evaluation is going to link to your next paragraph, just keep it kind of short and then just link it straight onto paragraph 2. Sorry, the next paragraph.
Okay.
It's paragraph 3. So we're going to
Yeah.
say our deficit is very bad. If it's persistent, this is what happens, and it leaves us very vulnerable to supply and demand side shocks.
Okay.
And that's the last one to evaluate. So let's think of something to evaluate that way.
Okay.
The best thing I can think of is that it's like a free market economist would say that this is natural and would incentivize us. Like it's like a sign that hey, we need to work on our supply side. Like if this doesn't happen, we wouldn't know that we have to improve our supply side. So
Yeah.
this shock does happen, and let's just say it causes a recession or something quite bad, then by the end of the recession, we as a country economy will know that we have to improve our supply side. And then we can do that by
Yeah.
improving education and training or infrastructure. Okay. And then just conclude
Okay.
overall, I would say a current account deficit is bad if it's persistent, but if it's not persistent, it's not likely to be that bad.
Okay.
The meeting's going to end now, so just join back.
Okay.
So what is an exchange rate?
Um, is it exchange rate is like when you compare two currencies and how strong one is compared to the other.
Exactly. So a nice way of saying that is the price of one currency in terms of another. Okay.
Okay.
Cool. There's 2 types of exchange rates. There's fixed exchange rates and there's floating exchange rates. And do you know what the difference between those 2 are?
I don't, but I'm guessing one is Actually, no, I don't know.
Yeah, that's fine. Most countries like the UK and the USA have a floating exchange rate. Okay.
Okay.
So that's just when the value of the currency is determined by demand and supply of the pound, for example. Yeah. So if
Okay.
demand for the pound goes up, then the price will go up, or if demand for the pound goes down, then price will go down, or supply and so on. Okay.
Okay.
Fixed exchange rates is when value of a currency can be changed by the central bank using currency reserves. So in the UK, what does the central bank mostly do?
There's a like fixed exchange rates. No, no, interest rates.
Interest rates. Exactly. But some countries, like China, the central bank doesn't really care about interest rates, but they care about exchange rate. So the central bank will focus on that. Okay. Instead of like in the UK, where the central bank focuses on changing the interest rates. Does that make sense so
Okay.
far?
Yeah.
Cool. That brings me onto my next point. A central bank cannot change both interest rates and exchange rates.
Okay.
When I say they can't control both interest rates and exchange rates. Okay. That's like an important fact for essays when we come to the evaluation after.
Okay.
Can you try to think about why that's the case? I'll pause the recording. So the reason that you can't possibly control both of these things is, let's say that if you increase interest rates, what would happen?
Will there be more money in the bank? People will save more.
People would save more, right?
Yeah.
But that also means like people from other countries, so they would want to buy, I mean, hold their savings in UK banks, kind of. That's like how I would think about it.
Yeah.
That's called money flows. So there would be money flows into the UK. So people would buy the pound if they had other currencies. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So then the currency, the value of the pound would go up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So imagine if you want high interest rates. Why would you want high interest rates, by the way? Why would the Bank of England do that?
Uh, is it to reduce inflation?
Yeah, yeah, to reduce inflation. Exactly. So imagine you're increasing interest rates to reduce inflation, but then it's at the same time it's affecting the pound, so you can't do both. Like, let's say if we want let's say on the other hand, we want economic growth, right?
Yeah.
We would lower interest rates. But then what would happen to the currency?
Would it get weaker?
Exactly. But then the currency would get weaker. So the point is you in the UK we'll lower or higher the interest rates, and then whatever happens to the pound, it happens. We don't really have any control of it. It's fine. Ideally, we want the pound to be stable, but it's not a major objective for us because we need to
Yeah.
interest rates purely to control economic growth and inflation. Is that confusing or does that make sense?
No, it makes sense.
Yeah. So you can't have both your perfect interest rates and your perfect exchange rate because one will affect the other.
Is there a conflict of objectives?
Yeah. But that's why we don't count the exchange rate as one of the objectives, although it's linked to the balance of payments.
Okay.
Cool. Um, So let's go into more detail about reasons for having each of these. So let's start with fixed exchange rates. China have fixed exchange rates, and this works really well for them based on their objectives. China rely on export-led growth. Okay, they export a lot of things to America.
Yeah.
If a country wants to keep attracting exports, would they want their currency to be quite high or be quite low?
Um, I, f- I feel like it's low because then people can buy cheaper from them.
Exactly. So China would want their currency to be devalued constantly so that it is attractive for the USA to buy goods and services from them. So you know that how we change our interest rates and stuff to change inflation. China don't care about stuff like that as much. China only care about getting their exports done to the USA. So they will keep
Okay.
on making their currency weaker. We can't do that. The UK cannot change. Like the UK can't be like, hey, I want the pound to be go up or the pound to go down. Let me do this. They can't do that because we follow this system. China followed this system, so they can do that. So the next question is, how would they do that? How would they devalue their currency?
Um,
I'll give you a clue. So it's based on the fact that China hold reserves of
is it
what's the Chinese currency? Is it I know it's yen, but
yen? Yen, I think.
Yuan. Okay, cool. Of yen and dollars. Okay. So what would they do with the yen and the dollars? Would they buy dollars or buy yen or sell dollars or sell yen? Like, what would they do to lower their currency? I'll pause it again. So just to go over that. So um China will have reserves of yen and dollars, which they can use to buy and sell. They can put it on sale or use it to buy the other thing. So if China sell, basically supply more yen in order to buy dollars, it increases the value of the dollar and decreases the value of the yen. Yeah.
Yeah.
And whenever exports are drying up, they'll do this to make exports more attractive again.
Okay.
And actually, over time, it can lead to dependence because the USA will buy stuff like, you know how Apple is designed in California, manufactured in China, or something like that. Whatever stuff that
Yeah.
comes from China, they can become dependent on it, and then that will allow China to continue growing, and maybe they won't need to reduce the currency anymore as well.
Okay.
So China will have a persistent current account surplus. So it's related to what you're doing at school. Okay. On the main disadvantage is that they have no control over interest rates. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. The floating exchange rate is what the UK have. So the benefit is that we have control over interest rates. It's also much easier. Like like having exchange rate policies like very complicated and requires um a lot of attention. So it could also lead to government failure. So that's another thing. Um, and then the downside is we have to control the balance of payments in other ways. So let's say the UK wants a balance of payments, which we do, which is one of our objectives. Um, right now, or most of the time, we're in a small current account deficit. What
Yeah.
would the UK do What would the UK do to reduce the current account deficit or prevent it getting worse? What policies could they do? Because they can't really do the exchange rate thing. So one easy way for the UK to boost exports is with supply side policies. So China can just reduce the value of their currency, and that makes their goods more attractive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
On the other hand, the UK would have to improve their goods and services, make their exports more attractive with supply side policies. So we can reduce cost of production, basically we can improve on cost, quality, quantity, and then make
Shift LRS up.
exactly shift LRASF up and um make exports more attractive. And that's a very long-term thing. So that won't happen overnight. If we wanted to get people buying, let's say, TVs from the UK, then we'd have to put a lot of investment in to improve the processes made to make TVs in the UK. But until then, people would only buy TVs from Sony and Samsung, so countries in Asia.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's one way. And another way is what you were mentioning to me earlier, but I'll explain the reasoning behind it, is with interest rates. But it's not ideal. So what we would do is we would lower interest rates, which would make our currency. What would happen to our currency if we lower interest rates?
Um, would it become
That's fine, just have a guess.
would it be, would it become stronger
Why?
because there's more money in the reserves because people save more?
It's the opposite. High interest rates is what you were thinking. But yeah, so low interest rates means people save less and spend more, right?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. So low interest rates means makes our currency makes savings less attractive in the UK. So less flows into the economy, right?
yeah.
Makes our currency weaker. And remember, if our currency is weaker, does that make exports or imports more attractive?
Is it exports?
Yeah. So that's the same thing that China do with this. Yeah.
Oh,
But
okay.
the downside of this is we wouldn't do this. Like it wouldn't really be a smart idea because it's gonna have so much impact on UK objectives, like affecting people's savings, mortgages, inflation. Yeah.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
yeah,
So we have no control over the balance of payments. It's like if we just think about like compared to China, we don't have much control over our balance of payments.
yeah.
The best thing we can do is supply side policies, which means that we're improving the quality of our products and making stuff attractive for other people in other countries.
Okay.
Cool.
So, yeah.
And then that takes me on to the last thing that I just forgot to mention. Um, so we were talking about how the UK can either use supply side policies or interest rates, which isn't ideal. One more thing that the UK government can do if they want to improve the current account deficit is protectionism. Have you done protectionism at school?
Um, I, I've heard of it before. I don't know though, but
So
I've heard of
protectionism is like
protectionism
another
before.
lesson altogether, but you can bring that into this topic when we do that.
Oh, I know it's like tariffs and importation taxes.
Exactly, tariffs, quotas, and stuff like that. So Protectionism is another way because it can reduce imports.
Okay.
Yeah, all of these topics link together. So there's a certain different subtopic on protectionism that you would learn separately, and then this exchange rate stuff, and then balance of payments, and they all come together, and you can have so many different types of questions.
Okay.
Cool. Then overall, if we have the other question for current account deficit, so what are the best methods to reduce a current account deficit? We now know 3 solid methods. So those solid methods are: one, supply side policies, which you can just use year 12 knowledge for, and go through how supply side policies increase LRAS or shift it to the right and increase the quality, quantity, and cost of producing goods and services, which makes our exports more attractive, either because they're better or cheaper. And then the evaluation is that they are very expensive and they have a huge time lag, and we still might struggle to compete with other countries who are not just a bit better than us, but a lot better than us at producing certain things. Maybe they've had economies of scale from producing it for years and years. Another one is exchange rate policy. So first of all, this depends on if we have a fixed or floating exchange rate. If we have a floating exchange rate, it would mean devaluing our currency by reducing interest rates, and that's a bad or difficult policy because we need to use interest rates solely for the purpose of controlling inflation, not controlling exchange rates. But if it's a fixed exchange rate country, then that could be possible. But because the questions are usually about the UK, that wouldn't really be the case. And we talked about the evaluation of those as well earlier. And then the third method is protectionism. And I would just go straight into it and just say one example is a tariff and do that in a lot of detail. Make sure you do the diagram, talk about that in a lot of detail. And with the diagram, you have a lot to talk about itself. And when we did the diagram, we talked about all the evaluations, like the tax revenue and if we can compete and so on.